The coffee boiled over again. Samuel Rivers watched the dark liquid hiss against the cast-iron stove, making no move to lift the pot. 2 years since Martha died, and he still brewed enough for 2. Dawn crept through the ranch house windows, illuminating empty chairs and dust-covered memories. Outside, cattle lowed their morning complaints. Samuel set 2 plates on the pine table, habit's cruel joke, then returned one to the shelf with practiced resignation. The Winchester above the mantel hadn't been fired since Martha's burial. Samuel touched its stock each morning, a ritual as empty as his conversations with her rocking chair. He stepped onto the porch, squinting at the horizon where Mesa Ridge cut the sky like a broken promise. Something fluttered on the barbed wire-torn fabric, dark with blood, desert sage beneath it stained crimson. Samuel's pulse quickened. After 2 years of numbing sameness, change had finally come calling. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The blood trail led through prickly pear and mesquite, each drop already darkening in the morning heat. Samuel followed on foot, leading his mare, the canvas water bag slapping against the saddle with each step. Whatever had bled here had moved with purpose, dragging itself toward the dry wash that cut through his eastern pasture. The sun climbed higher, transforming the desert into a furnace. Samuel paused at a cluster of creosote bushes, their resinous smell sharp in his nostrils. More blood here, smeared across the pale rocks, fresh enough that flies hadn't found it yet. "Easy, girl," he murmured to his mare as she tossed her head nervously. The horse had caught a scent that troubled her, something beyond blood. The trail curved around a massive boulder, its shadow providing brief respite from the sun. Samuel stopped short. There, collapsed against the base of a dying cottonwood, lay a figure in torn doeskin, an Apache woman. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward the Colt at his hip, then stopped. She wasn't moving. Her doeskin dress, once decorated with intricate beadwork, hung in tatters. A deep gash ran along her left leg from knee to ankle, the blood now caked with desert dust. Her feet, wrapped in worn moccasins, showed she'd walked miles, maybe days, before collapsing here. He approached slowly, boots crunching on gravel. "Miss Ma'am." No response. Her face, turned toward the pale bark of the cottonwood, revealed nothing. Long black hair, matted with sweat and dust, obscured her features. Samuel knelt carefully, aware of every sound in the desert silence. Apache raids had been fewer lately, but tensions still ran high. If her band found him here... He reached out, touched her shoulder gently. The woman's head lolled forward, and Samuel caught his first glimpse of her face. Young, perhaps 25 summers. Her lips, cracked and bleeding, had pulled back from her teeth in the rictus of severe dehydration. But she was breathing, shallow and ragged. "Goshgan," Samuel said, using one of the few Apache words he knew. Friend. His pronunciation was terrible. Learned years ago from an army scout, but it was all he had. The woman's eyelids fluttered. Dark eyes, unfocused and glazed with fever, tried to find him. Her mouth moved, but no sound emerged except a rattling breath. Her hand lifted slightly, trembling, reaching toward the canteen. She'd seen his canteen. Samuel quickly unhooked it from his belt, unscrewed the cap. "Two," he said. Another word dredged from memory. "Water." He supported her head, brought the canteen to her lips. Slowly now. Slowly. The first drops seemed to revive something primal in her. She grabbed at the canteen with surprising strength, trying to gulp, but Samuel pulled it back. "No. You'll make yourself sick. Small sips." She made a sound, then frustration, desperation, need all rolled into a wordless plea. Her eyes locked onto his, and in them Samuel saw not an Apache, not an enemy, but a human being clinging to life's edge. He gave her another small sip. This time she managed to swallow properly. Her eyes closed in what looked like prayer or profound relief. When they opened again, they were clearer, more focused. She tried to speak, managing only a whisper that Samuel couldn't understand. Her hand moved to her stomach, made a cradling gesture. Children. She was trying to tell him about children. Your children, Samuel asked, knowing she couldn't understand. Where are they? The woman's strength failed her then. Her eyes rolled back, and she slumped against him, unconscious but breathing. Samuel sat there in the meager shade, supporting her weight, feeling the fever radiating from her skin through the doeskin. He thought of Martha, how she'd burned with fever those last 3 days, how he'd sat helpless, watching her slip away. The doctor had been 2 days' ride away, and by the time he'd arrived, it was over. Samuel had buried his wife in the small cemetery plot behind the ranch house, under the cottonwood she'd loved. Kindness costs nothing but means everything, Martha used to say. Usually when Samuel grumbled about giving credit at their tiny ranch store to struggling neighbors, the woman in his arms moaned softly, her body trembling despite the heat. The gash on her leg needed cleaning and binding. She needed water, food, shelter. She needed help that Samuel could provide, if he was willing to risk it. Taking an Apache woman to his ranch would set every neighbor talking. Some would say worse than talk. The Hendersons had lost their son to an Apache raid 5 years back. The town marshal still wore the scar from an arrow across his cheek. But leaving her here meant death. Samuel knew that with the same certainty he knew the sun would set. The buzzards were already circling high above, patient and knowing. He looked at the woman's face again, younger than Martha had been. Someone's daughter. Someone's mother. If he'd understood her gesture correctly, somewhere, children waited for her return. Samuel shifted her weight, preparing to lift her. His back protested. 53 years of ranch work had taken their toll, but he managed to get her up, carrying her like a child toward his patient mare. We're going to have company. Belle, he told the horse, who snorted and stamped but stood still as Samuel struggled to position the unconscious woman across the saddle. It would be a long walk back to the ranch, leading Belle carefully to keep the woman from sliding off. The sun climbed higher, and Samuel pulled his hat low against its glare. Each step took them farther from the simple, empty life he'd known for 2 years. Each step was a choice, and Samuel made it again and again, moving steadily toward whatever consequences awaited. The journey back to the ranch house stretched into an eternity. Samuel led Belle with one hand while steadying the unconscious woman with the other, stopping every 100 yards to ensure she hadn't shifted dangerously on the saddle. The sun had reached its noon height, beating down mercilessly on his shoulders through the worn cotton shirt. Almost there, Belle, he murmured, as much to reassure himself as the mare. The ranch house finally came into view, its adobe walls and pitched roof a welcome sight after the grueling mile-long trek. As they approached the gate, Samuel caught movement from the corner of his eye. The Henderson's boy, Jimmy, sat atop his paint pony on the ridge overlooking Samuel's property. The boy's eyes widened when he spotted the figure draped across Belle's saddle. Without a word, Jimmy wheeled his horse around and galloped off, undoubtedly racing home to spread the news. That tears it, Samuel muttered. By sunset, every ranch within 10 miles would know he'd brought an Apache woman to his home. He could already imagine the conversations, the judgment, the warnings. Old man Henderson would probably ride over with his shotgun, talking about Christian duty and the safety of decent folk. But that was a problem for later. Right now, the woman needed care. Samuel managed to carry her from the horse to the house, her fevered body limp in his arms. She weighed less than Martha had at the end, when illness had stripped away everything but determination. He shouldered through the front door, pausing in the dim coolness of the main room. 3 doors led off from here: his own sparse bedroom, the storage room that had once been meant for children who never came, and Martha's room. He'd closed that door 2 years ago and hadn't opened it since. The woman moaned softly, her head rolling against his shoulder. There was no choice, really. His narrow cot wouldn't do, and the storage room held only grain sacks and old tack. Samuel approached Martha's door. shifting the woman's weight to free one hand. The brass doorknob was cool under his palm, familiar yet foreign after so long. The hinges creaked as the door swung open, releasing the scent of lavender in closed spaces. Afternoon light filtered through lace curtains Martha had ordered from the Sears catalog 3 years ago. The carved pine bed frame stood exactly as he'd left it, the homespun cotton sheets still tucked with hospital corners the way Martha insisted. Her hairbrush lay on the dresser beside the small daguerreotype taken on their wedding day, both of them young, serious, hopeful. Samuel laid the Apache woman on the bed, trying not to think about the last person who'd lain there. She immediately curled onto her side, mumbling words in her language that sounded like names soft, urgent repetitions. Shiye. Naiche. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the longing in it was clear. Children's names. Had to be. You'll see them again, Samuel said quietly, though she couldn't understand. I promise you that. He lit the coal oil lamp on the bedside table, Martha's lamp, with its etched glass chimney depicting morning glories. The warm light pushed back the room's shadows, making it feel alive again for the first time in 2 years. The woman's leg needed immediate attention. Samuel retrieved Martha's medicine chest from the top shelf of the wardrobe, the camphor smell strong as he opened it. Everything remained exactly as Martha had organized it: rolled bandages, brown bottles of laudanum and carbolic acid, clean muslin strips, a paper packet of willow bark for fever. His hands shook slightly as he prepared a basin of clean water. Martha had taught him basic doctoring necessary knowledge on a ranch far from any physician. You never know when you'll need to patch someone up, she'd said, showing him how to clean wounds properly, how to make poultices. The gash on the woman's leg was worse than he'd initially thought. Not just deep, but inflamed, the edges angry red. Infection had already started its work. Samuel cleaned it carefully, using carbolic acid despite knowing the sting would be fierce. The woman jerked, eyes flying open, a cry escaping her lips. Gosh Khan, Samuel said quickly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. Friend, helping. Her dark eyes searched his face, confused and fearful. Then they focused on the medicine chest, the bandages in his hands, and some understanding seemed to dawn. She nodded slightly and closed her eyes again, gripping the quilt as he continued his work. Samuel prepared a poultice of crushed willow bark and calendula from Martha's dried herb collection, binding it against the wound with clean muslin. The woman endured it all without another sound, though tears leaked from beneath her closed eyelids. 2, she whispered, the Apache word for water he'd used earlier. Samuel quickly brought her a cup, supporting her head while she drank. This time she sipped slowly, her body recognizing its limits. When she finished, she looked at him with such gratitude that it made his chest tight. Ayana, she said softly, placing a trembling hand on her chest. Then she pointed at him, raising her eyebrows in question. Samuel, he replied, understanding. Samuel Rivers. Samuel, she repeated carefully, then closed her eyes again, exhaustion claiming her. Samuel pulled Martha's rocking chair from the corner to the bedside. He'd need to keep watch, make sure the fever didn't worsen in the night. He collected supplies: clean water, more muslin strips, the bottle of laudanum he hoped he wouldn't need. The rifle from above the mantel he propped beside the door, not for the woman, but in case her people came looking, or in case the Hendersons decided to take matters into their own hands. As darkness fell, Samuel lit more lamps, started coffee on the stove, and settled into the chair. The woman Ayana slept fitfully, occasionally crying out names in her fever dreams. Each time, Samuel would lean forward, use a cool cloth on her forehead, whisper reassurances she couldn't understand but might feel. The night stretched ahead, full of uncertainty. Through the window, Samuel could see lights from the Henderson ranch in the distance. By now, the whole valley would know. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, questions, possibly trouble. But tonight, in Martha's room with its lavender scent and wedding photograph, Samuel kept vigil over a stranger who wasn't really a stranger at all. She was just another human being who needed help, who had children waiting somewhere, who deserved a chance to see another sunrise. The horsehair mattress creaked as Ayanna shifted, her hand reaching out in sleep, grasping at air. Samuel caught it gently, held it until her fingers relaxed. "You're safe," he told her. "You're going to be all right." But outside, a coyote howled at the rising moon. The coffee bubbled on the stove. The lamp flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And Samuel Rivers, who had spent 2 years alone with his grief, found himself suddenly, unexpectedly, needed again. It was terrifying. It was also, he realized with surprise, a relief. The mantel clock struck midnight, its chime eerily loud in the stillness. Samuel jerked awake in the rocking chair, immediately alert. Ayanna's breathing had changed rapid, shallow gasps that spoke of crisis. He placed his hand on her forehead and pulled it back in alarm. The fever had spiked dramatically. Her skin burned like sun-baked stone, and sweat beaded across her face despite the cool night air drifting through the open window. "No. No. No," Samuel muttered, jumping to action. He'd seen fever like this before, watched it claim Martha despite all his efforts. But not again. Not this time. He grabbed the pewter wash basin, filled it with the coolest water from the ceramic jug. The muslin cloth soaked quickly as he began the battle against the heat consuming her body. Cool compress on her forehead, another on her wrists, a third at her throat. The lavender sachets Martha had tucked throughout the room seemed to mock him with their peaceful scent. Ayanna began to thrash, her words tumbling out in fevered Apache. Samuel couldn't understand most of it, but certain words repeated names, he thought, and something that sounded like soldiers. Her hands moved as if pushing something away. Her face contorted in fear. "Shh, you're safe," Samuel said, catching her hands gently to prevent her from tearing at the bandages on her leg. "No one's going to hurt you here." She gripped his hand with surprising strength, her eyes flying open but seeing something beyond this room. "Inda!" She cried a word Samuel recognized as the Apache term for white men. "Inda soldiers. My children. Shaye." Her whole body shook with sobs. Though no tears came, she was too dehydrated for that. Through her fractured words and gestures, Samuel began to piece together her story. A cavalry patrol, separation from her band, children torn away in the chaos. She'd been trying to find them, walking for days through the desert, when injury and thirst finally brought her down. She whispered again, clutching Samuel's hand like an anchor. "My son. Naiche. My daughter." The anguish in her voice cut through Samuel like a blade. He knew that particular pain, the hollow ache of loss that never truly healed. Without thinking, he found himself talking to her, knowing she couldn't understand but needing to share the weight he'd carried alone for 2 years. "I lost my Mary too," he said quietly, refreshing the compress on her forehead. "Not a child by blood, but Martha and I. We raised her from the time she was 3. Her parents died of cholera, and we took her in. She was our whole world for 7 years. Ayanna's unseeing eyes tracked toward his voice, her grip on his hand loosening slightly. "Scarlet fever took her," Samuel continued, surprised by how easily the words came after so long silence. "One day she was playing by the creek, laughing at the minnows, and 3 days later," he swallowed hard. "Martha never recovered from it. The grief hollowed her out, made her vulnerable when her own fever came calling 5 years later." The mantel clock ticked steadily, marking the passage of the long night. Samuel continued his ministration's cool water, gentle words, patient presence. He found himself humming an old hymn Martha used to sing while working. "Shall we gather at the river?" The melody seemed to calm Ayanna, her thrashing gradually subsiding. By 3 in the morning, the crisis had peaked. Samuel had been ready to use the laudanum if necessary, But Ayana's fever began to break on its own. Her skin grew clammy rather than burning, and her breathing deepened into something more natural. "That's it," Samuel encouraged, wringing out another cool cloth. "Fight through it. Your children need you to fight through it." As the first gray light of pre-dawn touched the eastern window, Ayana's eyes opened, truly opened. Seeing the room and Samuel for what they were, she looked confused but present, no longer lost in fever dreams. "Water?" Samuel asked, reaching for the cup. She nodded weakly, then surprised him by pointing at the cup and saying clearly, "Two." "Yes, two," Samuel agreed, then pointed at it himself. "Water." "Water," she repeated carefully, the English word foreign on her tongue. A tiny smile tugged at her cracked lips when Samuel nodded encouragingly. She drank slowly, her eyes taking in the room, the lace curtains growing visible in the strengthening light, the medicine chest, the daguerreotype on the dresser. Her gaze lingered on the photograph of Samuel and Martha, understanding dawning in her expression. "Your woman?" she asked in broken English, clearly words she'd learned somewhere before. Samuel nodded. "My wife, Martha." He touched his chest, then gestured to indicate absence. "Gone. 2 winters." Ayana's eyes softened with sympathy. She touched her own chest. "My man, 3 summers." Then her face crumpled slightly. "My children, we'll find them," Samuel said firmly, though he had no idea how to keep such a promise. "When you're stronger, we'll find them." She studied his face for a long moment, then reached out and touched the back of his hand, a gesture of gratitude that needed no translation. They sat in comfortable silence as dawn properly broke, painting the room in soft gold. Samuel was just starting to believe they'd weathered the worst of it when he noticed something through the window that made his blood run cold. A dust cloud on the southern horizon, too large to be a single rider. Multiple horses, moving fast toward his ranch. "Company coming," he said quietly, more to himself than to Ayana. She must have seen the tension in his posture because she struggled to sit up, alarm flashing across her face. "Inda?" she asked fearfully. "White men." Samuel didn't know how to answer. It could be the Hendersons and their neighbors, coming to demand he turn out the Apache woman. It could be cavalry, following her trail. Or it could be Apache. Ayana breathed, staring out the window. Her voice held a mixture of hope and fear. "My people." Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle by the door, then stopped. If it was her band, coming for her, any show of weapons would only make things worse. But if they thought he'd captured her, held her against her will. "Can you speak to them?" he asked urgently. "Tell them I helped you." She tried to stand but swayed dangerously, her injured leg unable to bear weight. Samuel caught her before she fell, easing her back onto the bed. She was far too weak to walk outside, possibly too weak to even call out loud enough to be heard. The dust cloud grew larger, closer. Samuel could make out individual riders, now many riders, perhaps 50 or more. His mouth went dry. He'd faced Confederates at Antietam, stood his ground in battle. But this was different. This was his home, and he was alone except for an injured woman who might not be able to save him even if she wanted to. "Ghosh Khan," Ayana said firmly, gripping his arm. "You are Ghosh Khan. Friend." She pointed to herself, then to him, then made a protective gesture. "I will speak." Samuel helped her to the chair by the window where she could be seen but still supported. Her face was gray with exhaustion, but her eyes blazed with determination. She began to sing a low, carrying melody in Apache that seemed to be a signal or call. The riders were close enough now that Samuel could see details. Apache warriors, painted for war, weapons ready. His heart hammered against his ribs as they spread out, surrounding his ranch in a wide circle. "So many," he whispered. Ayana squeezed his hand. "My grandfather," she said. pointing to an elderly rider on a painted horse. "Big chief." Then, with effort, she added in English, "I am important to them." Samuel understood then. This wasn't just any Apache woman he'd saved. The size of the war party, the elaborate dress of the leaders, Ayanna was someone of significance. The granddaughter of a chief, perhaps more. The sun cleared the horizon fully, painting the scene in brilliant light. 300 warriors sat motionless on their horses, weapons glinting, faces stern as carved stone. The elderly chief dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and full of authority. Samuel looked at Ayanna, weak but resolute in the chair. Then he looked at the warriors, prepared for violence but holding, waiting. The next moments would determine everything. He took a deep breath, squeezed Ayanna's hand once for courage, and walked to the door. Whatever came next, he would face it head on. He owed her that much. He owed himself that much. The door opened on its hinges, and Samuel Rivers stepped out to meet whatever judgment awaited. Samuel stepped onto the porch, his hands held away from his body, fingers spread to show they were empty. The morning sun caught the silver conchos on the nearest warrior's belt, momentarily blinding him. He blinked, kept his movements slow and deliberate. No sudden gestures, nothing that could be interpreted as threat. 300 Apache warriors sat their horses in perfect stillness, forming a massive circle around his ranch house. Their silence was absolute. No war cries, no shouted demands, just hundreds of dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. The quiet was worse than any battle cry could have been. It spoke of controlled fury, of violence held in check by the thinnest thread. The horses stood like statues, their war ponies decorated with red handprints and lightning bolts painted in white clay. Spanish bits jangled softly when one occasionally tossed its head, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. Eagle feathers adorned lances held perfectly vertical, and beaded rifle scabbards caught the morning light. These were not raiders or a hunting party. This was a war band, painted and prepared for blood. The elderly chief Ayanna had pointed out remained mounted, his weathered face painted with red ochre and geometric patterns that made his expression unreadable. He wore an elaborate headdress of eagle feathers that marked him as a man of immense importance. His eyes, black as obsidian, studied Samuel with an intensity that seemed to peer into his soul. Samuel's throat felt like sand. He swallowed, tried to remember the few Apache words he knew. His hands remained visible, palms forward in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "Goshgun," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Friend." The word fell into the silence like a stone into a deep well. No response. Not a single warrior moved. Samuel tried again, gesturing slowly toward the house behind him. "The woman. Ayanna. She is inside. Safe. I help." He struggled for the Apache word. "I helping. Medicine." A younger warrior near the chief shifted slightly, his hand moving to the rifle across his saddle. The chief raised one finger, a minute gesture, and the warrior froze. The chief's eyes never left Samuel's face. Slowly, with the gravity of mountains moving, the chief dismounted. He was older than Samuel had first thought, perhaps 70 winters, but he moved with the fluid grace of a man half his age. His moccasins made no sound on the hard-packed earth as he approached, stopping just beyond arm's reach. When he spoke, his voice was deep and carried the authority of thunder. The Apache words meant nothing to Samuel, but the tone was clear, questioning, demanding, dangerous. The chief gestured toward the house, then at Samuel, his meaning clear. "What have you done with her inside?" Samuel said, pointing. "Hurt. Leg hurt." He gestured to his own leg, miming injury. "I found her. By the wash. Gave water to. Medicine." The chief's eyes narrowed. He spoke again. More words Samuel couldn't understand, but he caught one in Da, spoken with obvious suspicion. "White man. Why would a white man help an Apache woman?" Samuel remembered the Union Army canteen hanging on a peg just inside the door. Martha had always said it made him look more respectable to other whites. A veteran rather than just another rancher. Maybe it would mean something here too. Moving very slowly, telegraphing his intentions, he reached back and retrieved it. The chief's eyes flickered to the canteen, noting the U.S. stamped into its side, the brass fittings tarnished with age. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not trust, but perhaps a degree less hostility. He'd likely seen such canteens before, on soldiers who'd fought in the war between the whites. "Soldier," Samuel said, touching his chest, then shaking his head. "No more. Just—" He gestured to the ranch, the small herd of cattle visible in the distance. "Rancher. Alone." The chief studied him for a long moment, then turned and spoke to the mounted warriors in rapid Apache. Several dismounted, including a woman with gray streaking her hair, and a younger man whose resemblance to Ayanna was unmistakable, a brother, perhaps, or cousin. They approached with the same careful grace as the chief, their faces hard with suspicion. The woman's eyes were particularly fierce, and Samuel realized she must be Ayanna's mother or aunt. Her hand rested on the knife at her belt, ready. "She's inside," Samuel said again, backing toward the door slowly. "Come. See?" It was a risk, inviting armed Apache warriors into his home. If they decided he'd harmed Ayanna, he'd be dead before he could speak another word. But what choice did he have? Keeping them out would only confirm their suspicions. He opened the door wide, stepped aside to let them enter first, a gesture of trust that the chief seemed to recognize. The elderly man entered, followed by the woman and younger warrior. The rest remained outside, still as death, waiting. Samuel led them through the main room to Martha's bedroom, where Ayanna lay on the bed, still unconscious or asleep. The morning light through the lace curtains illuminated her fevered face, the careful bandages on her leg, the medicine chest still open on the bedside table. The woman rushed forward with a low cry, dropping to her knees beside the bed. Her hands moved over Ayanna's face, checking her temperature, examining the bandages with practiced efficiency. She was a healer, Samuel realized, probably the band's medicine woman. The chief remained in the doorway, his eyes taking in every detail of the room, the feminine touches, the daguerreotype of Samuel and Martha, the obvious care that had been taken with Ayanna's wounds. His gaze lingered on the lavender sachets, the clean sheets, the basin of water with bloody cloths that spoke of a night-long vigil. The medicine woman looked up at Samuel, and for the first time, there was something other than hostility in her face. She spoke rapidly to the chief in Apache, gesturing to the bandages, the medicines, the careful positioning of Ayanna's injured leg. The younger warrior had moved to the window, looking out at the hundreds of his brothers still surrounding the house. He said something sharp to the chief, a question or challenge. The chief responded firmly, but doubt colored his tone. They were trying to understand why a white man would help one of their people, especially given the current tensions between Apache and settlers. Samuel pointed to the medicine chest. "My wife's," he said, touching his chest over his heart. "She died 2 winters. He gestured to the room. "Her room. Not used. Until now." The chief's eyes showed a flicker of understanding. Loss was a universal language. Ayanna stirred slightly, a soft moan escaping her lips. The medicine woman leaned close, speaking softly in Apache, stroking her hair. But Ayanna didn't wake, lost in whatever dreams the fever had brought. The tension in the room ratcheted higher. Without Ayanna's testimony, Samuel remained suspect. The chief spoke to the medicine woman, who shook her head. She couldn't wake Ayanna safely, not in her current state. The younger warrior's hand had moved to his knife. He spoke harshly, gesturing from Samuel to the door, clearly suggesting they take Ayanna and deal with Samuel as they saw fit. The chief held up a hand for silence, but Samuel could see the doubt in his eyes growing. "Please," Samuel said, surprising himself with the desperation in his voice. "I found her dying. I brought her here, gave her water, medicine, watched over her all night." And he pointed to the rocking chair, the rumpled blanket that showed where he'd kept vigil. She spoke of her children, Shaye, Naiche. She was trying to find them. The mention of the children's names caused an immediate reaction. The medicine woman's head snapped up, her eyes wide. She spoke rapidly to the chief, who stepped forward, his weathered face intense. "You know their names," the chief said in heavily accented English, surprising Samuel. "How?" "She told me," Samuel said. "In her fever, she called for them, over and over. Shaye, Naiche." She was desperate to get back to them. The medicine woman stood slowly, moving closer to Samuel. She studied his face like she was reading a map, looking for deception. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her somewhat. She spoke to the chief, her tone less certain but no longer actively hostile. The younger warrior protested, gesturing angrily. The chief silenced him with a look that could have frozen fire. Then he turned back to Samuel. "We wait," he said in his broken English. "She wakes. She speaks. Then we know." It was not quite a reprieve, but it was better than the alternative. Samuel nodded, understanding. They would wait for Ayana to wake and either confirm his story or condemn him. The warriors would remain, watching, waiting, ready to exact vengeance if their suspicions proved correct. "I'll make coffee," Samuel said, needing to do something with his hands. "And food. Your people can water their horses at my well." The chief considered this, then nodded slowly. He spoke to the younger warrior, who reluctantly left to relay the message outside. The sound of movement followed warriors dismounting, horses being led to water, but the circle around the ranch never broke. The medicine woman had returned to Ayana's side, producing her own medicines from a beaded pouch at her waist. She began to sing softly, a healing chant that seemed to harmonize with the morning breeze through the window. Samuel watched her work, noting how similar her techniques were to what he'd done during the night cool water. Careful attention to the wound, gentle touch. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace. The warriors outside remained in position, patient as the stones themselves. Inside, the chief sat in Samuel's offered chair, his eyes never leaving Samuel for long. The medicine woman continued her ministrations, occasionally speaking to Ayana, trying to coax her back to consciousness. Samuel busied himself with small tasks, brewing coffee, setting out what food he had, trying to look useful rather than threatening. The morning stretched into afternoon, the tension in the house thick as molasses. Several times, Ayana stirred, mumbling in Apache, but didn't fully wake. The younger warrior returned periodically to speak with the chief, clearly reporting on the mood outside. Samuel caught enough of their tone to understand that patience was wearing thin. Some of the warriors wanted to take Ayana and leave. Others, he suspected, wanted blood regardless of the truth. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Ayana's eyes finally fluttered open. The medicine woman cried out softly, leaning close, speaking rapidly in Apache. Ayana's gaze was confused at first, unfocused. Then she saw the medicine woman, the chief, and her eyes widened in shock. She tried to sit up but was too weak. Her gaze found Samuel standing in the corner, and something passed across her face. Recognition, relief, gratitude. She spoke, her voice barely a whisper, but her words caused an immediate change in the room's atmosphere. The medicine woman's fierce expression softened. The chief's shoulders relaxed slightly. Even the younger warrior looked less murderous. Ayana continued speaking, gesturing weakly toward Samuel, then to her bandaged leg, the medicine chest, the cup of water on the bedside table. Her tone was clear. This man had saved her life. The chief stood slowly, his ancient joints protesting. He walked to Samuel, stopped an arm's length away, and studied him with those penetrating black eyes. Then, in a gesture that seemed to cost him greatly, he extended his hand not in the white man's handshake, but palm forward, a gesture of peace and acknowledgement. "You are not enemy," he said in his careful English. "You are..." He struggled for the word, then said something in Apache, Ayana, weak but determined. Translated, he says you are touched by the spirits, a bridge between worlds. Samuel didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded, accepting the chief's gesture of peace. Outside, he could hear the news spreading among the warriors, the tension dissipating like morning mist. But they didn't leave. As the sun set, painting the desert in brilliant crimsons and purples, the Apache remained, their council fires beginning to dot the landscape around his ranch. They would stay, Samuel realized, until Ayana was well enough to travel. And somehow, that didn't frighten him as much as it should have. Ayana's eyes opened fully, focusing with sudden clarity on the faces surrounding her bed. The medicine woman leaned back slightly, allowing Ayana to see beyond her to where her grandfather stood, his war paint stark against his weathered features. For a moment, no one moved. Then tears began to stream down Ayana's face, silent. Overwhelmed tears of relief and disbelief. "Grandfather," she whispered in Apache, her voice rough from fever and thirst. "You came for me." The chief's stoic expression cracked, revealing the frightened grandfather beneath the war leader's mask. He moved forward, taking his granddaughter's hand in both of his weathered ones, speaking rapidly in Apache. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable relief, fear, love, and questions all tumbling together. Ayana's eyes moved around the room, taking in the medicine woman, who Samuel now understood was her aunt, and the younger warrior, who stood tense by the door. Her gaze finally settled on Samuel, standing quietly in the corner, trying to make himself unobtrusive. She spoke in Apache, her voice growing stronger with each word. Samuel caught fragments he recognized, too, for water, a gesture toward her bandaged leg, pointing at Samuel. The medicine woman interrupted with questions, which Ayana answered patiently, her free hand moving to illustrate her words. The rapid exchange continued for several minutes. Samuel heard certain words repeated, Goshgan friend, Pesh iron, which seemed to refer to his medicine tools, and something that sounded like God but with Apache inflection. The younger warrior interjected harshly at one point, but Ayana's response was firm, almost scolding. As she spoke, Samuel noticed the transformation in the room. The chief's shoulders gradually relaxed, the rigid line of his spine softening. The medicine woman's hand moved away from her knife, instead reaching out to touch Ayana's forehead with obvious affection. Even the younger warrior's aggressive stance eased, though suspicion still lingered in his eyes. Finally, Ayana switched to English, her words careful but clear. "Grandfather, this is Samuel Rivers. He found me by the wash. I was dying." She paused, swallowing hard. "The sun was killing me. My blood was leaving my body, and the buzzards were already circling. This man carried me to his home. He gave me water when I could barely swallow. He cleaned my wound with his medicine, stayed awake all night to keep the fever from taking me." The chief turned to study Samuel anew, his obsidian eyes searching. Ayana continued, her voice growing more emotional. "He could have left me there. Many white men would have. Some would have." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the air. "Instead, he brought me to his wife's room, his dead wife's room, that he hasn't entered in 2 years. He used her medicines, her bed, her sacred things to save someone his people call enemy." She paused, tears fresh on her cheeks. Then, switching back to Apache, she spoke with intense conviction. Samuel didn't need to understand the words to recognize their weight. The medicine woman gasped softly. The chief's eyes widened. The younger warrior took a step forward, staring at Samuel with something approaching awe. "What did you tell them?" Samuel asked quietly. Ayana turned to him, her dark eyes luminous with gratitude. "I told them the truth, that you were sent by the spirits, that the Creator put you in my path because it wasn't my time to die, that you are God sent a bridge between our peoples, just as grandfather said." The chief moved then, his movements deliberate and ceremonial. He spoke in Apache to the younger warrior, who immediately left the room. Through the window, Samuel could see him running toward the gathered warriors, his voice carrying across the desert evening. "My name," Ayana said, touching her chest. Is Ayana? It means eternal bloom in our language. I am the daughter of Red Sky, who was killed in a raid 2 summers ago, and granddaughter of Chief Joseph Standing Bear, whom you see before you. The chief nodded at the mention of his name, then spoke in his careful English. I am Standing Bear. This, he gestured to the medicine woman, is Ayana's aunt, Maria Crowfeather. She is our healer. Maria stepped forward, her fierce expression replaced with something approaching warmth. She took Samuel's hand, examining it as if she could read his character in the calluses and scars. She spoke in Apache to Ayana, who translated. She says your hands are honest hands, working hands, not killing hands. She thanks you for caring for me when she could not. Before Samuel could respond, the younger warrior returned, carrying something wrapped in painted parfleche. Behind him, 2 other warriors entered, their arms full of items. Samuel realized with growing amazement that they were bringing gifts. Standing Bear took the parfleche bundle and unwrapped it carefully, revealing an elaborate horse bridle decorated with silver conchos and turquoise beads. The leather was soft as butter, worked with patience and skill. He held it out to Samuel. This is too much, Samuel protested, but Standing Bear shook his head firmly. You gave life, he said simply. We give thanks. More gifts appeared, woven burden baskets filled with dried meat and herbs, a blanket with intricate geometric patterns that must have taken months to weave, a knife with a handle carved from elk antler. Each warrior who entered made a point of meeting Samuel's eyes, nodding with respect rather than suspicion. Ayana watched it all with tears still flowing. You don't understand, she said to Samuel. I am my grandfather's only surviving grandchild. My children Shiye and Naichi are the future of our band. Without me, she couldn't finish. Your children, Samuel said urgently. Where are they? You were looking for them when... Safe, Ayana assured him quickly. They were with my cousin when the soldiers came. I was gathering medicine plants alone. Got cut off from the band. I tried to circle back through the canyon, but I fell, cut my leg on the rocks. By the time I could walk again, the band had moved and I couldn't find their trail. Standing Bear spoke at length in Apache, gesturing toward the door. Ayana listened, then translated for Samuel. He says the warriors will make camp here tonight, around your ranch. Tomorrow, when I'm stronger, we'll leave. But... She paused, seeming to gather courage. He also says you have earned a place at any Apache fire. You are welcome in our camps, under our protection. Any enemy of yours is now enemy of the Apache. The weight of this offer wasn't lost on Samuel. In a land where Apache raids were still feared, where the army still hunted what they called renegade bands. This was more than gratitude. This was adoption into something larger, a crossing of boundaries that few white men ever experienced. Standing Bear reached into his own belongings and pulled out something that made the other Apache murmur with surprise: an eagle feather, perfect and unspoiled. He held it out to Samuel with both hands, speaking in Apache with great formality. This is... Ayana's voice caught. This is one of his own eagle feathers, from his war bonnet. It's the highest honor he can give. It means you're not just a friend, you're family. Samuel took the feather carefully, understanding its significance even if he couldn't fully grasp its cultural weight. I'm honored, he said, looking directly at Standing Bear. Deeply honored. The chief nodded, then spoke rapidly to his warriors. They began to file out, but not with the tension of before. Now their movements were relaxed, purposeful. Through the window, Samuel could see them spreading the news to the hundreds gathered outside. Weapons were being put away. Horses were being unsaddled. Cookfires were being built. Maria Crowfeather remained, pulling supplies from her medicine bag. She spoke to Ayana, clearly planning to take over the healing duties. But she also gestured to Samuel, including him in her instructions, showing him Apache healing techniques as if he were an apprentice worth teaching. As the sun set fully, painting the desert in deep purples and blues, Samuel found himself in a situation he never could have imagined that morning. His ranch was surrounded by 300 Apache warriors, but instead of fear, he felt an odd sense of security. Inside his home, in Martha's room, an Apache woman he'd saved was being tended by her aunt while her grandfather, one of the most feared war chiefs in the territory, sat at his kitchen table. Standing Bear had pulled out a ceremonial pipe, its bowl carved from red stone, its stem decorated with beads and small feathers. He prepared it carefully, his movements ritualistic and precise. When he offered it to Samuel, Ayanna explained, "Smoking together seals the bond. After this, you're truly one of us." Samuel took the pipe, following Standing Bear's gestures for the proper way to smoke it. The tobacco was different from what he knew, mixed with herbs that made the smoke sweet and heavy. As he passed it back to Standing Bear, he felt something shift, not just in the room, but in himself. The lonely rancher who had awakened that morning no longer existed. In his place sat a man who had crossed an invisible line, who had chosen compassion over fear, humanity over prejudice. The empty spaces in his life, carved out by Martha's death, were beginning to fill with something unexpected, not replacement, but expansion. His world, contracted by grief, was suddenly larger than he'd ever imagined it could be. Ayanna was translating something else Standing Bear was saying, but Samuel was only half listening, struck by the profound change a single day had brought. This morning he'd been alone. Tonight, he was surrounded by an entire community that now claimed him as their own. "Samuel," Ayanna's voice brought him back. "My grandfather asks if you would be willing to learn our language. He says a bridge must be strong from both sides." Samuel looked at the chief, at Maria preparing her healing herbs, at Ayanna weak but alive in the bed, at the warriors outside who had transformed from threat to protection. He thought of Martha, how she would have loved this moment, this connection across cultures that fear usually kept apart. "Yes," he said simply, "I would be honored to learn." Standing Bear smiled the first time Samuel had seen the expression on the war chief's face. It transformed him from fearsome leader to grandfather, from legend to man. Outside, someone had begun to drum a steady, rhythmic beat that seemed to echo the pulse of the desert itself. Others joined in with songs that rose into the night sky. It wasn't a war gathering anymore. It had become a celebration of life saved, of boundaries crossed, of unexpected kinship born from simple human kindness. Tomorrow, Ayanna would be strong enough to travel. The Apache would leave, returning to their hidden camps in the mountains. But something permanent had been forged here in this unlikely place, something that would endure beyond this single encounter. Samuel Rivers was no longer alone. He had become what Ayanna had called him, a bridge between worlds. And for the first time in 2 years, that seemed like a life worth living. The morning sun painted the desert in soft pastels, a gentler light than the harsh glare that would come later. Samuel stood in his doorway, watching Apache women prepare breakfast over carefully maintained fires. The warriors had relaxed their circle, many now tending horses or crafting items from leather and wood. Children had appeared from somewhere. They must have been with the women who'd stayed back during the initial war party approach, and their laughter carried on the morning air. 3 days had passed since that first tense confrontation. Ayanna had grown stronger each day under her aunt's care, and this morning she'd insisted on sitting up properly, even managing to stand briefly with support. The infection in her leg was retreating, the angry red inflammation fading to healing pink. "Samuel," Ayanna called from inside. "Would you help me to the porch? I want to see my children." He found her sitting on the edge of the bed, Maria Crowfeather hovering disapprovingly. Ayanna had changed into a fresh doeskin dress that her aunt had brought, intricately beaded with patterns that seemed to tell stories. Her long black hair had been washed and braided, and for the first time, Samuel could see her as she truly was, not a desperate, dying woman, but someone vital and strong. "Your aunt doesn't think this is wise," Samuel said, noting Maria's frown. Ayanna spoke to her aunt in rapid Apache, her tone respectfully firm. Maria threw up her hands in a gesture that needed no translation. Universal exasperation with stubborn patience, but helped support Ayanna's other side as they made their way slowly to the porch. A cry went up from the camp when Ayanna appeared. Two small figures broke away from the group of children, racing toward the house with abandon. Shima Shima. They called Mother in Apache, Shie Naiche. Ayana's voice broke as she sank into the chair Samuel had placed for her. The children bounded up the steps and into her arms, a boy of perhaps 7 and a girl of 5. Both with their mother's delicate features and bright, dark eyes. They spoke rapidly in Apache, their words tumbling over each other, touching her face, her hands, as if to assure themselves she was real. Samuel stepped back, giving them space for their reunion, but Ayana caught his sleeve. "Stay," she said. "They should know who saved their mother." She spoke to the children in Apache, gesturing to Samuel. Their eyes went wide, and they studied him with the frank curiosity of the young. The boy Shai stepped forward and said something in Apache, then attempted it in careful English. "Thank you for Shima." "You're welcome," Samuel said, his voice rougher than intended. The boy's earnest gratitude, the girl's shy smile, it stirred something in him that had been dormant since Mary's death all those years ago. Standing Bear approached with several other Apache leaders, including a younger man Samuel had learned was White Eagle, a respected war leader. They settled onto the porch and ground nearby, creating an informal council. Maria brought out traditional Apache foods, fry bread still warm from the oil, dried venison, and something sweet made from mesquite beans. Samuel contributed what he had: coffee, sourdough biscuits from his starter that had survived since Martha's time, and preserved peaches he'd been saving. The ceramic dish he served them in had been Martha's pride, blue willow pattern shipped from back east. He noticed Standing Bear studying the delicate pattern with interest. "Your woman," Standing Bear said in his careful English. "She liked beautiful things." "She did," Samuel agreed, pouring coffee into cups. "She said beauty was necessary, especially in hard places." Ayana translated this for the others, and nods of understanding went around the circle. White Eagle spoke at length in Apache, gesturing expressively. Ayana listened, then turned to Samuel. "He's telling the story of how I came to be lost," she explained. "There was a cavalry patrol not attacking, just passing through our territory. But the young warriors were nervous. The soldiers were nervous. No shots were fired. But in the confusion of moving camp quickly, I was gathering medicine plants in a side canyon. A rock slide blocked the main path. By the time I found another way around, the band had moved." She paused, her children pressed against her sides. "I walked for 3 days, trying to find them. The cut on my leg happened the second day when I fell climbing rocks. By the third day..." She touched Samuel's hand briefly. "You know how you found me?" Shai looked up at Samuel with those serious dark eyes. In broken English mixed with Apache, he said, "Shima says you are good man, that you have sad heart, like her." The innocent observation hit Samuel unexpectedly. He found himself telling them about Martha, about Mary, about the years of silence that had followed their deaths. Ayana translated for those who didn't understand English, her voice soft and respectful of his grief. When he finished, Standing Bear spoke at length. Ayana translated, "My grandfather says that grief is like winter, necessary, but not meant to last forever. He says the spirits brought us together because both our hearts needed spring." The morning progressed into afternoon, the cultural exchange continuing naturally. The Apache women became curious about Samuel's ranch operations, particularly interested in his small garden where Martha had grown vegetables. They showed him their own techniques for finding and preparing desert plants for food and medicine. Samuel found himself demonstrating his sourdough starter, explaining through Ayana how it had been passed down through Martha's family for generations. The Apache women were fascinated, comparing it to their own fermented corn preparations. One elderly woman brought forth a parfleche bag containing their own starter for a traditional Apache bread. "She offers a trade," Ayana explained, smiling. "Your starter for hers. It's a significant gesture. Sharing the foundation of bread is like sharing life itself." Samuel accepted the trade solemnly, understanding the honor being offered. As he carefully stored the Apache starter in one of Martha's clean jars, he realized this was the first new thing he'd brought into the house since her death. The children had grown comfortable with him by now. Naiche, the little girl, brought him a corn-husk doll she'd been playing with, chattering in Apache. Ayana laughed, actually laughed, the sound like water in the desert. She's telling you the doll's entire life story, Ayana explained. Apparently, the doll has been on many adventures and fought a mountain lion. A mountain lion? Samuel asked the child, exaggerating his surprise. Was the doll frightened? Ayana translated. And Naichi shook her head vigorously, launching into another stream of Apache. The adults around them chuckled at her enthusiasm. It was then that Samuel realized he was smiling. Really smiling. Not the polite expression he wore for neighbors, but genuine amusement. When Shayi joined his sister, adding his own embellishments to the doll's adventures, Samuel found himself laughing. The sound surprised him. Rusty from disuse, but real. Ayana caught his eye, her expression understanding. She knew what that laugh meant, what it cost, and what it gave back. As the day wore on, plans began to form. Standing Bear spoke with his council, then addressed Samuel directly. My granddaughter needs more healing time, he said. The journey to our camp is difficult, many rocks, steep paths. He gestured to Ayana's still bandaged leg. We ask she stays here more days, Maria stays too, to help. Samuel felt a flutter of something he couldn't quite name. Of course, as long as needed. But Standing Bear wasn't finished. The band must move. Soldiers watch for too many Apache in one place. But we leave warriors' protection for you, for her. That's not necessary, Samuel began. But White Eagle interrupted, speaking firmly in Apache. Ayana translated, he says it is necessary. Your family now. Family protects family. Also, she paused, a slight smile playing at her lips. He says your neighbors have been watching from the ridge. They need to see that you're under Apache protection. That any harm to you is harm to us. Samuel had noticed the distant figures observing his ranch. The Hendersons, certainly, and probably others. The presence of 300 Apache warriors had likely caused panic throughout the valley. There's something else, Ayana said, her voice becoming more tentative. My grandfather asks if you would be willing to learn more than just our language. He offers to have you taught our ways, not to make you Apache, but so you can truly be the bridge he spoke of, someone who understands both worlds. The weight of this offer settled on Samuel like a blanket. It wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something larger, a possibility of connection between peoples who had been enemies for so long. I would be honored, he said, meeting Standing Bear's eyes. The chief nodded slowly, then rose. He spoke in Apache to his people, his voice carrying authority and decision. The camp began to shift, preparing for departure. But as promised, a smaller group began setting up a more permanent camp near Samuel's well, perhaps 20 warriors and their families, including Maria Crow Feather. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, most of the band departed, their dust cloud gradually disappearing into the desert. Ayana remained on the porch, her children playing at her feet, Maria fussing over her bandages. You laughed today, Ayana said quietly, when they were momentarily alone. I did, Samuel admitted. First time in a very long time. It suits you, she said simply. Martha would be glad, I think. Samuel looked at her, this woman who'd stumbled into his life dying and had somehow brought it back to life instead. I think you're right. She always said the house was too quiet. Shaye ran up then, tugging at Samuel's sleeve, trying to show him a lizard he'd caught. As Samuel knelt to examine the boy's prize, he caught Ayana watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, gratitude mixed with something deeper, warmer. The desert was painting itself in evening colors again. But tonight, there would be no empty chairs, no silence filled only with memory. Tonight, there would be voices and laughter, children's stories and shared meals, the bridging of worlds that had seemed impossibly separate just days ago. Spring, as Standing Bear had said, was finally coming to Samuel Rivers's winter heart. 2 weeks had transformed the rhythm of Samuel's days entirely. The morning coffee ritual that had once been a solitary burden now began with 2 cups set out without thought, as natural as breathing. Ayanna would emerge from Martha's room, her room now. Samuel had begun to think of it moving carefully but steadily, her leg healing more each day. They had developed a comfortable routine of shared silence in these early hours. Sitting on the porch as the desert awakened, the 20 Apache warriors who'd remained were already about their morning tasks, their camp a respectful distance from the house but close enough for protection. Maria Crowfeather would join them sometimes, but more often she busied herself with gathering desert plants, trusting Ayanna's recovery to the quiet care that had developed between Samuel and her niece. "Your leg's better today," Samuel observed, noticing Ayanna hadn't winced when she'd descended the porch steps to check the garden. "Much better," she agreed, testing her weight on it. "Maria's medicines and yours together powerful combination." She'd been teaching him the Apache names for the healing plants, showing him how to prepare poultices and teas. In return, he'd been helping her English grow stronger, using Martha's old slate and chalk to write out words. The slate now lived on the kitchen table, covered with a mixture of English words and Apache translations. Samuel's blocky letters beside Ayanna's more fluid hand. "Today," Ayanna said, settling beside him with her coffee. "I'm strong enough to help with real work." Samuel started to protest, but she held up her hand. 2 weeks of sitting still. My grandmother would be ashamed. Apache women work, it's who we are. By mid-morning, she'd proven her point, helping him repair a section of fence that the cattle had damaged. Her hands were skilled with rope and leather, making quick work of lashing the rails. Shaye and Naichi played nearby, their laughter mixing with the sound of work. The boy had taken to following Samuel around, mimicking his movements with serious concentration. "He wants to learn ranching," Ayanna said, watching her son attempt to rope a fence post. "He says you're teaching him to be a man of 2 worlds, like you." "He's a quick learner," Samuel said, adjusting the boy's grip on the rope. "Reminds me of—" He stopped, but Ayanna's gentle look encouraged him to continue. "Reminds me of Mary at that age, always watching, always wanting to help." They worked in companionable rhythm, the desert heat building toward noon. When they took a break for water, Ayanna surprised him by heading into the house and returning with a mason jar of Martha's preserved peaches. "We should eat these," she said simply. "Food is meant to nourish the living, not gather dust for the dead." Samuel stared at the jar, Martha's neat handwriting on the label, dated 3 years ago. He'd been saving them without really knowing why. Ayanna opened the jar without ceremony, spooning the golden fruit onto 2 plates she'd brought out. The peaches were perfect, sweet and bright with summer flavor. As they ate, Samuel felt something tight in his chest loosening. These preserves, like everything else of Martha's, could be honored through use rather than enshrinement. "We need supplies," Samuel said, making a decision. "Flour, coffee, fabric for new clothes for you and the children. Town's a half-day's ride." Ayanna's eyes widened slightly. "Town, your people won't." "They'll have to get used to it," Samuel said firmly. "You're under my protection, and the sooner folks understand that, the better." Maria protested when told of the plan, speaking rapidly in Apache, but Ayanna was determined. She changed into her best doeskin dress, the one with the most elaborate beadwork, and carefully braided her hair. Samuel hitched up the wagon, helped her onto the seat, and set off toward Willow Creek. The first person they encountered was Tom Morrison, riding fence for the Double Bar Ranch. His horse shied when he saw Ayanna, and Tom's hand went to his sidearm before recognizing Samuel. "Rivers, what in the hell?" "Mrs. Ayanna is a friend and guest," Samuel said evenly. "We're heading to town for supplies." Tom's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Without another word, he spurred his horse away, undoubtedly racing to spread the news. By the time they reached Willow Creek's main street, a small crowd had gathered outside Paulson's Mercantile. Samuel helped Ayanna down from the wagon, noting how she held her head high despite the stares and whispers. "Savages on the ranch is one thing. someone muttered. Bringing them to town is another. Samuel turned toward the voice Bill Henderson, as expected. Mrs. Ayanna saved my life, Samuel said, the lie coming easily because the deeper truth was too complex for this moment. She was injured, and I'm returning the favor. Anyone has a problem with that. They can take it up with me. Or with us, came another voice. Samuel turned to see White Eagle and 3 Apache warriors emerging from the shadow of the livery stable. They'd followed at a distance, protection Ayanna hadn't mentioned. The crowd stepped back collectively. Bill Henderson's face went red, but he held his tongue. Inside the mercantile, Mrs. Paulson stood behind the counter, her expression severe. But when Ayanna approached and said in careful English, "Good morning, ma'am. Beautiful store you have," something in the woman's face softened slightly. Samuel conducted his business efficiently, but Ayanna lingered over the fabric selection, running her fingers over a bolt of blue calico. "For Nietzsche," she said softly. "She's never had a white woman's dress." "Then she should have one," Samuel said, adding it to their purchases. The tension in the store was thick until the door chimed and Reverend Claiborne's wife entered. Elizabeth Claiborne was known for her progressive views. She'd been one of the few to defend Chinese miners during the Troubles 5 years back. She looked at Ayanna directly and said, "Good morning. I'm Elizabeth Claiborne." Ayanna responded with natural dignity. "Good morning, Mrs. Claiborne. I am Ayanna." "Are you staying at Mr. Rivers's ranch?" Elizabeth asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Yes. He saved my life when I was injured and alone. Now I help him as I heal." Elizabeth glanced at Samuel with something like approval. "Martha would be glad the house has life in it again," she said quietly. The mention of Martha's name in this context, not as betrayal but as continuation, seemed to shift something in the store's atmosphere. Mrs. Paulson actually managed a tight smile when tallying their purchases. As they loaded the wagon, Ayanna said quietly, "That was brave, what you did. Standing up to neighbors. That's not brave." "No," she said. "Letting them see you've changed. That takes real courage." And the ride home was quieter, both lost in thought. As they neared the ranch, Ayanna suddenly said, "Stop here, please." They were beside a small cluster of desert wildflowers, evening primrose and desert marigold, blooming despite the heat. Ayanna climbed down carefully and gathered a small bouquet. Back at the house, she went directly to the main room where Martha's blue glass vase sat empty on the mantel, as it had for 2 years, without asking permission. Ayanna filled it with water and arranged the wildflowers in it. Samuel stood in the doorway, watching. He waited for the pain, the sense of violation. Instead, he felt something else entirely rightness. The flowers caught the late afternoon light, filling the vase with color and life. "Thank you," he said simply. That evening, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch as had become their custom. The Apache camp's fires glowed in the distance. Maria had retired early, giving them privacy with the pointed unsubtlety of matchmaking ants everywhere. "Tell me about Red Sky," Samuel said. "Your husband." Ayanna's face softened. "He was a good man, brave warrior, gentle father. He could make Shy laugh when no one else could. He died protecting our band from Mexican slavers." She paused. "The grief was so heavy I thought it would crush me, but the children needed me, so I carried it. Martha got sick so gradually I didn't notice at first," Samuel shared. "She'd always been delicate, but after Mary died, she just faded, like she was following our daughter willingly. The fever at the end was almost merciful. It was quick." They sat with their shared losses, comfortable in the understanding that only those who've grieved deeply can provide. "Your neighbors," Ayanna said eventually, "they think I'll leave when I'm healed." "Will you?" Samuel asked, his voice carefully neutral. "My children are happy here. They're learning both worlds, as Standing Bear hoped. Shaye speaks of you constantly, Nietzsche has decided your barn cat is her best friend. That's not what I asked. Ayanna turned to look at him directly. What are you asking, Samuel Rivers? He met her gaze, seeing in it possibilities he hadn't dared consider. I'm asking what you want, not what's expected or proper or safe, what you want. I want my children to grow up without fear. I want to plant a garden and see it bloom. I want to wake up each morning knowing we have a home. She paused, her voice dropping softer. I want to stop being lonely in my grief. Stay, Samuel said, the word escaping before he could second-guess it. You and the children, not as guests, not as obligation. Stay because this feels like home. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached over and took his weathered hand in hers. The Apache have a saying, the earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. This land, this place, it's claiming us both, I think. Is that a yes? It's a maybe becoming yes, she said with a small smile. Ask me again when the desert roses bloom. Samuel squeezed her hand gently. The desert roses bloom in spring. I know, Ayanna said, her meaning clear. They sat together as the stars emerged, their hands linked, their grief not gone but transformed into something that could coexist with hope. Inside the house, Martha's vase held wildflowers. In the barn, 2 cultures' children slept peacefully, and on the porch, 2 wounded hearts began to imagine wholeness. The night wind carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of Apache singing. White Eagle's warriors would leave soon. Ayanna no longer needed their protection. But something new was taking root here, something that transcended the boundaries that usually divided their peoples. Samuel thought of Standing Bear's words about being a bridge between worlds. He hadn't understood then what that might mean. Now, with Ayanna's hand warm in his, with her children becoming dear to him, with the ranch transforming from monument to grief into a living home again, he began to see it, not just a bridge between Apache and white, but between past and future, between loss and love, between ending and beginning. The healing time, it turned out, wasn't just for Ayanna's leg. It was for everything broken that was ready to mend. The desert roses had bloomed overnight, as if the land itself knew what this day would bring. Samuel stood on his porch at dawn, marveling at the profusion of pink and red blossoms that covered the bushes around his ranch plants that hadn't flowered since Martha had tended them 3 years ago. The sight felt like a blessing, a sign that even the desert approved of what was about to happen. Shia father, young Shi burst through the door, his excitement barely contained. The people are coming, so many people. Samuel ruffled the boy's hair, this child who had begun calling him father 2 months ago, the Apache word flowing as naturally as the English. Let them come, he said, his own anticipation matching the child's. Today, everyone is welcome. 6 months had passed since Ayanna had first collapsed at his door. 6 months of transformation, not just for Samuel and Ayanna, but for the entire valley. The Apache protection camp had long since departed, but their presence had shifted something fundamental in the community's understanding. Samuel Rivers was no longer just a grieving rancher. He had become something unprecedented, a white man trusted by the Apache, a bridge between worlds that had seemed forever separated. Ayanna emerged from the house not from Martha's room anymore, but from their room, though today tradition demanded they prepare separately. She wore a dress that had taken 3 months to create, a collaboration between Apache weavers and Elizabeth Claiborne's sewing circle. The base was finest doeskin, soft as butter, decorated with intricate beadwork telling the story of their meeting, a water symbol for the life Samuel gave her, mountains for the strength they'd found together. Over this, she wore a overdress of cream-colored cotton lace, delicate as spider silk, that Elizabeth had donated from her own wedding trousseau. You're not supposed to see me yet, Ayanna said, but she was smiling. Apache tradition or white tradition? Samuel asked. Both, She laughed. Maria and Mrs. Claiborne actually agreed on something. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. From the east came the Apache, not just Standing Bear's band, but members of 3 other bands who'd heard of this unprecedented union. They came in their finest clothes, faces painted for celebration rather than war, bringing gifts and songs. From the west came the townsfolk, tentative at first, but growing bolder as they saw the peaceful intent. Bill Henderson was among them, to Samuel's surprise. The man dismounted stiffly, approached with obvious discomfort. "Rivers," he said, then paused, struggling. "I was wrong. About them. About her. Martha she would have understood before I did." He thrust out a wrapped package. "Wedding gift? It's not much." Samuel accepted it graciously, knowing what this cost the prideful man. "Thank you, Bill. Your presence means a great deal." The ranch had been transformed over the past week. Apache women and townswomen had worked side by side awkwardly at first, then with growing enthusiasm to prepare for this day. Long tables made from sawhorses and planks stood ready for the feast, covered with both Apache burden baskets full of traditional foods and checked tablecloths bearing the best dishes from town. Reverend Claiborne's pulpit stood beside a ceremonial fire circle, Christian and Apache spiritual traditions preparing to merge in a ceremony no one had attempted before. Standing Bear arrived with full ceremonial dignity, his war bonnet replaced with an elder's headdress that marked him as a peace chief. He embraced Samuel formally, then spoke in Apache that Ayanna translated, "Today, you truly become my grandson. Today, 2 peoples become 1 family." Maria Crow Feather had been fussing over Ayanna all morning, but now she approached Samuel with something wrapped in soft leather. Inside was a shirt of the finest buckskin, decorated with designs that marked him as family to Standing Bear's band. "You wear this," she said in her improving English. "Apache part of ceremony." Samuel changed into the shirt, keeping his best black wool trousers and boots, a visual representation of the 2 worlds meeting in him. Elizabeth Claiborne pinned a sprig of desert rose to his chest, completing the mixture. The ceremony began at noon. When the sun stood directly overhead, Reverend Claiborne opened with a prayer in English, his words carefully chosen to honor both traditions. Then Standing Bear spoke in Apache, his deep voice carrying across the assembled crowd. White Eagle translated for the townspeople, his English much improved over the months. "The Creator makes all people," Standing Bear said. "Different colors, different ways, but all people. Today we see the Creator's hand bringing together what fear kept apart. This man, Samuel Rivers, came to us through an act of kindness. He gave life to my granddaughter when she was dying. But more than that, he gave us hope that our peoples need not always be enemies." When it came time for the vows, Samuel and Ayanna faced each other before the assembled crowd. They spoke first in English, for the townspeople to understand. "Ayanna," Samuel said, his voice strong despite his emotion, "you brought life back to a place that had become a tomb. You and your children filled my silence with laughter, my emptiness with purpose. I promise to honor both worlds you carry, to help your children grow strong in both traditions, and to love you through whatever seasons come." Ayanna's eyes shimmered with tears as she responded, "Samuel, you saw me not as Apache or enemy, but as a person needing help. Your kindness saved not just my life, but my spirit. I promise to make your home our home, to honor Martha's memory by filling this house with life, and to stand beside you as we build something new from our broken pieces." Then they repeated vows in Apache, words that Standing Bear had taught Samuel over the past months. The Apache people murmured approval at Samuel's pronunciation, at the respect he showed for their language. The Christian blessing followed the Apache blessing. Rings exchanged after the ceremonial blanket was wrapped around them. When Reverend Claiborne pronounced them married, and Standing Bear declared them one, a cheer went up from both sides of the gathering. Naiche ran forward, clutching her cornhusk doll in one hand and a wooden top Samuel had carved for her in the other. "Now you're really my father," she declared in a mixture of Apache and English that made everyone laugh. The feast that followed broke down the remaining barriers. Tom Morrison found himself in animated conversation with White Eagle about horse breeding. Elizabeth Claiborne and Maria Crowfeather compared notes on healing herbs, finding more common ground than either had expected. Children played together, Apache and White, their laughter needing no translation. As the sun began to set, Standing Bear called for silence. The old chief stood, his presence commanding even in celebration. "I have lived many winters," he said. White Eagle translating. "I have seen much war, much sadness between our peoples. But today, I see something new. Not Apache becoming White, not White becoming Apache, but both becoming something more." He gestured to where Samuel and Ayanna stood together, her children pressed close to them. "This family is the future I want for all our children, not the loss of who we are, but the addition of understanding. My grandson Samuel has learned our ways without forgetting his own. My granddaughter Ayanna has embraced new traditions without abandoning the old. This is strength." He raised his cup coffee in a tin mug, that perfect mixture of cultures. "To the bridge between worlds, may it stand strong for generations." The toast was echoed in 2 languages, cups and glasses raised under the star-emerging sky. The celebration continued into the night, Apache drums eventually joining with Tom Morrison's fiddle in a rhythm that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. Late that evening, after the guests had departed or made camp at a respectful distance, Samuel and Ayanna sat at their kitchen table. 2 plates, 2 cups, 2 forks, such a simple thing that had once caused such pain. Now it felt right. Complete. "Martha's chair?" Ayanna said, noticing something new in the corner. Beside Martha's rocking chair sat another, carved from juniper by Apache hands, its design echoing but not copying the original. "Standing Bear's gift," Samuel explained. "He said the past should be honored but not lived in alone." Through the window, they could see the desert roses still blooming in the moonlight, their petals silver-touched and magical. On the mantel, Martha's vase held fresh flowers, a tradition Ayanna had maintained daily. The house itself seemed to breathe with contentment, no longer a memorial but a living home. "Are you happy?" Ayanna asked, reaching across the table to take his hand. Samuel thought of the morning 2 years ago when he'd mechanically set 2 plates from habit and grief. He thought of the blood on the barbed wire that had led him to Ayanna. He thought of the 300 warriors who'd surrounded his ranch, of the journey from suspicion to trust, from loneliness to love. "I'm more than happy," he said, squeezing her hand. "I'm alive again." Shai wandered in, rubbing sleepy eyes. "Can I have water? Shai, father." Samuel rose to get it, the ordinary domestic moment profound in its simplicity. As he handed the cup to the boy, he caught his reflection in the window, a man wearing an Apache shirt over American trousers, his face no longer carved with grief lines but soft with contentment. Naiche appeared next, trailing her favorite blanket. "Story," she requested hopefully. "One story," Ayanna agreed. Then bed. They gathered in the main room, the children curled between them on the new couch that had replaced Samuel's austere single chair. Samuel began a story Martha used to tell, about a rabbit and a coyote. Ayanna wove in Apache elements as he went, creating something entirely new from the familiar tale. This was their life now, not Apache, not White, but something unique, something that existed in the space between worlds. The ranch had become neutral ground where former enemies could meet, where understanding could grow from the seeds of compassion. As the children's eyes grew heavy, Samuel carried Shie, while Ayanna led Naiche to their rooms. The domestic ritual, once so painful to observe in memory, now filled him with quiet joy. They met back in the main room, where the 2 rocking chairs sat waiting. "Standing Bear was right," Ayanna said, settling into her chair. "About spring coming to winter hearts." Samuel reached over, taking her hand as they rocked gently. "The desert roses knew," he said. "They were waiting for the right moment to bloom again. Like us." Ayanna agreed. Outside, a coyote called to the moon, and somewhere in the distance, an Apache flute answered. The sound blended with the creak of rocking chairs, the whisper of wind through desert roses, the quiet breathing of sleeping children. It was the sound of home, of family, of wounds healed and life renewed. Samuel Rivers had awakened that morning 6 months ago to empty echoes and bitter coffee. Tonight, he would sleep beside his wife while their children, for they were truly their children, now dreamed safely under his roof. The transformation was complete, but the story, he knew, was just beginning. The desert had bloomed, and with it, two hearts that had thought themselves finished with love had discovered they were simply waiting for the right season to flower again. 6 months after their wedding, Samuel and Ayanna's ranch had become the heart of an unprecedented community. Where once stood barriers of fear and prejudice, now grew understanding. The monthly gatherings brought Apache and townspeople together, sharing meals, stories, and slowly dismantling generations of mistrust. The moral was simple yet profound. A single act of compassion can transform not just two lives, but entire communities. Samuel's choice to help a dying woman, despite the danger and social cost, created ripples that touched hundreds. His ranch, once a monument to grief and isolation, had become sacred ground where former enemies discovered their common humanity. Family, they learned, isn't bound by blood or race but by choice and commitment. Samuel gained not just a wife but children who called him father, a grandfather in Standing Bear, and an extended Apache family. Ayanna found not just safety, but a home where both her worlds could exist in harmony. The children grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable at Sunday service or Apache ceremonies. Their story proved that gratitude creates bonds stronger than fear can break. When we choose to see others' humanity over their differences, we build bridges that can bear the weight of history's wounds. Have you ever had to choose between what was safe and what was right? Like Samuel did when he found Ayanna dying by the wash.